Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. The Salic Law and the Spark of War. You find yourself in the courts of early 14th century France. The air is stagnant with precedent, law, and expectation. Nothing moves quickly here, least of all the lines of royal succession. The death of King Charles IV in 1328 did not come as a surprise. What did come as a surprise, however, was the lingering question he left behind. Who would be king of France now? This wasn't just a question of preference or politics, it was a question that would ignite a century-long conflict between two great kingdoms. At its core, it revolved around a piece of legal tradition known as the Salic Law, ancient Frankish code that, while obscure and inconsistently applied, would come to define the legitimacy of rule for generations. The seeds of the Hundred Years' War were not sown in battlefields or bloodshed, but in dusty courtrooms and family trees. What was the Salic Law? The Salic Law originated with the Salian Franks, a Germanic tribe that contributed significantly to the foundation of what would become the Kingdom of France. Codified in the 6th century under King Clovis, this law covered everything from theft to murder to property inheritance. Most of it dealt with mundane concerns to compensate someone for stealing a pig, for example. But one clause, buried in its depths, would later become weaponized. No part of the inheritance of land can pass to a woman. Originally, this had little to do with royal succession, and more to do with agricultural property and control. But by the 14th century, France's nobles and legal advisors interpreted it with greater weight. No woman could inherit the throne, nor could her sons inherit through her bloodline. It was not law in the formalized sense as we understand it today. There was no parliament to ratify it, no constitutional authority, but legal traditions mattered, especially when they served the ambitions of powerful men. Charles IV's death and the succession crisis. Charles IV, the last direct Capetian king, died in February 1328 without leaving a surviving male heir. His wife was pregnant, and the realm waited anxiously for the birth. If the child were a boy, the crisis would be averted. A legitimate male successor would carry the Capetian line forward. But the child was a girl. Suddenly, France had no direct male heir. There were two main candidates for the throne. Philip of Valois, a cousin to Charles IV on the male side. Edward III of England, the young king of England, who was Charles IV's nephew through his mother, Isabella of France. Edward's claim was stronger by proximity, was the grandson of Philip IV, just one generation removed. Philip of Valois was a cousin, further down the genealogical tree. But Edward's claim came through a woman. And here, the old Frankish clause took on monumental significance. Legal maneuvering, how power shapes precedent. The French barons, clergy, and legal minds convened. Their conclusion: women could not inherit the throne of France, and neither could their sons inherit through them. This interpretation of the Salic Law conveniently excluded Edward. Why did this happen? Well, Philip of Valois was already acting as regent. He was present. He was French. He had powerful allies in the nobility and the church. And Edward II, barely 15 years old, was an English king with a shaky grip on his own realm. To many in France, Edward's ascension would be an unacceptable threat to sovereignty. So in May 1328, Philip of Valois was crowned Philip VI of France. No war broke out immediately. In fact, Edward III attended the coronation, but tension had been ignite quiet polite tension that would soon smolder into flames. A precedent rooted in fear. The real fear behind excluding Edward was that it would make France a vassal of England. Kings had long claimed territories across both sides of the Channel, a tangled legacy of feudalism and intermarriage. Already, England held the Duchy of Gascony in southwestern Francia, constant source of diplomatic wrangling. If Edward became king of both realms, French independence would be at risk. Thus, legal tradition became a political shield. The Salic law, long ignored and selectively enforced, was now a tool of sovereignty. But more than that, it was a signal to England that France was not theirs to claim. Edward did not press the issue at once. His regency still influenced his decisions, and his early reign was consumed with domestic unrest. But the slight was not forgotten. In fact, it simmered within the English court for nearly a decade before erupting. Early tensions and the road to war. In the years following Philip VI's coronation, relations between England and France continued in diplomatic limbo. On paper, they were at peace, but in practice, they were rivals maneuvering through the thickets of politics, economics, and legitimacy. Disputes over Gascony intensified. French pirates harassed English ships in the Channel. Trade restrictions tightened. And while these issues could have been managed through negotiation, they were inflamed by the underlying dynastic insult. Edward had not only been passed over, he had been legally disqualified. Eventually, by 1337, Edward III made a bold and symbolic gesture. He formally claimed the crown of France, declaring himself the rightful heir. And with that act, the 100 Years' War had its official beginning not through a battle, but through a legal rejection and a claim of blood. Dynasties, law, and the fate of kingdoms. It is easy to imagine that wars begin with trumpets, marches, and declarations of glory. But more often, they begin with paperwork, legal precedent, and fear. The story of the Salic law is one of how words written in an old Frankish code never meant to define the fate of kingdoms became the cornerstone of one of the longest wars in European history. Yet questions remain. Did France truly believe in the sanctity of the Salic law, or was it merely convenient politics? Would Edward have been a different kind of monarch had he inherited both kingdoms? And what would have happened if that unborn child of Charles IV had been a boy? What alternate Europe might have unfolded from that single divergence? A young king with an inherited grudge. You are now in the court of Edward III of England, not yet 30, but already burdened by the tangled legacy of his forebears. His mother, Isabella of France, often remembered in English chronicles as the she-wolf of France, had once been the queen consort of England. She was also the daughter of Philip IV of France, a direct link to the Capetian line. Edward's blood was royal on both sides, and yet that same blood was dismissed as legally invalid by the French nobility, rendered impotent by an obscure Frankish code that most people in England considered archaic or outright fabricated. Though Edward had initially accepted the coronation of Philip VI and had even performed homage to him for Gascony in 1329, a quiet bitterness lingered in his court. With each passing year, that bitterness fermented. His early rule was dominated by domestic turmoil, particularly the fallout from his father Edward II's disastrous reign and his mother's regency. But once Edward III took control in 1330 by overthrowing his mother's lover Roger Mortimer, he began to assert himself with growing confidence. At the heart of his maturing ambition was a single, burning question: was his claim to the French crown unjustly denied? Gascony, a thorn in both crowns. The Duchy of Gascony had long been a geopolitical irritant, a vestige of earlier Anglo-French entanglements. Originally brought under English control through the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II in the 12th century, Gascony was technically a fief of the French crown, even though it was governed by the English. This meant that the King of England was legally a vassal of the King of Francia, situation, as awkward as it was combustible. By the 1330s, this awkward arrangement became intolerable. French officials routinely interfered in Gascon affairs, often to the detriment of English interests. French courts would summon English subjects to appear before them, challenging Edward's authority. This wasn't just an administrative nuisance. It was a deliberate strategy by Philip VI to provoke Edward to force him to either accept subordination or rebel. In 1337, after years of tension, Philip VI formally confiscated Gascony. It was the final straw. The declaration of claim, Edward's symbolic challenge. Edward's response came not on the battlefield, but in heraldry and words. In late 1337, he issued a formal declaration of claim to the throne of France, reviving his inheritance through his mother Isabella. To signify this claim, Edward quartered the fleur-de-lis, the royal symbol of France, with the 3 lions of England on his coat of arms. This symbolic act was monumental. In the medieval world, heraldry mattered was the visual language of legitimacy. By displaying the fleur-de-lis, Edward wasn't just making a legal argument. He was branding himself as a king denied. This public claim to the French throne was both provocation and justification. It gave moral weight to what would soon become a prolonged military campaign. It also redefined the conflict. No longer was this a dispute over land or feudal rights, it was now a dynastic war for a crown. Diplomacy, alliances, and war by proxy. But Edward did not march into France immediately. Instead, he played a careful game of diplomacy. He sought alliances with Flanders, the Holy Roman Empire, and various discontented lords of the Low Countries. Many of these allies had their own grievances with Philip VI, particularly over trade and taxation. Edward was especially interested in Flanders, a region economically tied to England through the wool trade. The weavers of Ghent and Bruges depended on English wool, and Philip's interference in this trade created fertile ground for rebellion. In 1339, Edward personally led an expedition to the Low Countries. It was poorly coordinated, underfunded, and logistically chaotic. The campaign failed to achieve anything of military significance. However, it served as a symbolic beginning to hostilities. It also drained Edward's treasury. Warfare was expensive, and England's fiscal system was not equipped for sustained campaigning. Parliament grew restless at the cost, and the nobility of whom still had lands in France were cautious about open war. Still, the lines had been drawn. Skirmishes broke out along the borders. Gascon lords took sides, and all the while, the unresolved question of legitimacy loomed large over the continent. Propaganda, identity, and the legalization of war. In the medieval world, war was not merely fought with swords. It was justified through sermons, proclamations, and careful narratives. Edward needed to convince not only his allies, but also his own people that his claim was righteous. Clerics and chroniclers were enlisted to shape public perception. They spoke of ancient wrongs, of rights denied, of God's will. Edward's court painted Philip VI as a usurper, a man who twisted law for personal gain. Meanwhile, Philip VI told his own story, that Edward was a rebellious vassal, an ambitious boy king who refused to honor feudal oaths. This war of words was just as important as any physical battle. Both sides sought moral high ground, because in a world where kings ruled by divine right, legitimacy was everything. The problem of inheritance in a fragile world. What's striking about this early phase of the 100 Years' War is how deeply it reflects the fragility of medieval monarchy. The entire conflict stemmed from a failure of succession, a common crisis in a world with high infant mortality and fragile dynasties. It's tempting to see war as inevitable, but the war that followed Charles IV's death was as much about the structure of medieval inheritance as it was about personal ambition. Had France permitted inheritance through the female line, something allowed in England and many other kingdoms, Edward's claim might have been accepted, but that would have meant welcoming an English king onto the French throne, and for the French nobility, that was a risk too great to take. Thus, a legal interpretation hardened into doctrine, and doctrine became war. The forgotten figures, jurists and clerks, often lost in this grand narrative, are the people who shaped the legal arguments themselves, not kings or generals, but clerks, jurists, and theologians. Men like Jean de Blanot and Pierre de Cognières, who advised the French court during the succession crisis, played key roles in interpreting the Salic law. Their opinions, grounded in Roman and canonical law, were instrumental in crafting the idea that succession through women was inherently unstable. These men never saw the battlefield. They never held a sword, yet their writings would go on to justify countless deaths over the next century. Their story is not dramatic. It is not filled with conquest or glory, but it is central to understanding how a paragraph in an old law book became the foundation for a dynastic catastrophe. A war that wasn't supposed to last. When Edward claimed the French throne in 1337, no one expected the war to last 100 years. Few wars ever do. It was expected to be brief, a matter of campaigns, negotiations, and settlements. But wars fueled by blood claims rarely end cleanly. Each battle would breed another, each peace treaty would be provisional, and with every new generation, the question of who was the rightful king would return, freshened by memory, myth, and new grievances. By the end of the 1330s, the stage had been set. The legal conflict had turned military. The rhetorical war had galvanized support, and Edward was ready to test his claim with steel. Still, one must ask, what if Edward had not claimed the throne at all? What if he had accepted Philip's coronation as final? Would Europe have avoided a century of bloodshed, or would a different conflict have taken its place, on perhaps even worse? Prelude to Invasion, a king transformed. The Edward III of 1340 was not the same uncertain monarch who had paid homage in 1329. He was no longer the boy navigating his mother's political intrigues or tolerating the dominance of French courts in Gascon affairs. By this time, he had become a seasoned political operator and a monarch fully aware of the stakes of kingship. His declaration of his claim to the French throne had not only escalated a legal debate, it had reshaped his reign. He was now no longer simply a king of England. He was the claimant king of France. This dual identity redefined both his personal authority and the identity of his court. All diplomacy, war planning, and financial maneuvering would now revolve around that claim. But the gap between a symbolic claim and actual conquest was wide. To bridge it, Edward would need more than words. He needed ships, men, and money. Financing war, the burden of claim. Long wars are rarely funded by passion alone. Edward faced the immense challenge of financing a continental war while maintaining stability at home. War required armies, armies required wages, and wages required taxation. England's treasury, already strained by intermittent campaigns, needed to be refilled. To do this, Edward turned to Parliament, the merchant classes, and foreign loans. He expanded the collection of customs duties, particularly on wool, England's most valuable export. The wool trade was now war's lifeline. The revenues from it fueled his military operations, while also politically binding Edward to the merchant elite. This transformation of war into economic policy shows one of the boring truths about medieval conflict. It was often less about banners and more about ledgers. Kings fought, in part, with coins. The Battle of Sluys 1340, War at Sea. The first major military success of Edward's claim came not on land, but at sea. In June 1340, Edward launched a naval campaign against the French fleet at Sluys, a port in modern-day Belgium. Philip VI, aware of the threat of English invasion, had assembled a massive navy there to block English shipping and potential landings. Edward's response was bold. Rather than wait, he sailed directly into confrontation. The Battle of Sluys was a gruesome and chaotic affair. The French ships were tightly chained together in defensive formation, a floating fortress. The English, using longbows from their ships and aggressive boarding tactics, overcame the French by turning the engagement into a series of bloody hand-to-hand struggles. The sea turned red, according to chroniclers. Thousands of French sailors died, some drowned, others slaughtered. It was, by medieval standards, a massacre. While not as famous as later battles like Creasy or Agincourt, Sluys marked the first significant blow Edward dealt to Philip VI. More importantly, it granted the English naval dominance, allowing them to safely ferry troops across the Channel in future campaigns. First land campaigns, the frustration of siege and logistics. After Sluys, Edward launched several land campaigns, including the costly and ultimately unsuccessful siege of Tournai. Here, Edward discovered the logistical nightmares of medieval warfare, an unglamorous reality rarely sung in poems. Sieges were not glorious. They were tedious, disease-ridden affairs. Soldiers died not from combat but from dysentery, starvation, and boredom. Supply lines were fragile. Hostile terrain made movement difficult, and towns often held out for months, confident that relief armies or winter would eventually force the attackers to retreat. In 1340, this is precisely what happened. Tournai held firm and the siege collapsed into political embarrassment. Peace negotiations, spurred by the Pope and other European powers, forced Edward to withdraw. No lands were gained, no decisive victories won. Only debts and exhaustion remained. The story of Tournai reminds us of the mundane side of dynastic warfare. Not all chapters are filled with triumph or heroism. Some are simply expensive failures written in mud and ink. The role of the Church and the fragile peace of Esplichin. Following the failed siege, Edward was drawn into negotiations mediated by the papal curia, which sought to prevent further Christian bloodshed in a time already devastated by internal turmoil and the looming specter of plague. The Truce of Esplichin, signed in 1340, temporarily halted open conflict between France and England. Yet this peace, like many throughout the 100 Years' War, was deceptively fragile. Neither side was truly committed to reconciliation. It was a pause for breath, a chance to rebuild forces, not a genuine resolution. This pattern of truces and resumed fighting would repeat throughout the war's century-long span. War was becoming institutionally normal feature of diplomacy, not its failure. The forgotten soldiers who fought this war. While kings and barons claimed the headlines, the burden of war fell on common men, farmers turned archers, craftsmen conscripted into siege work, merchants who found themselves paying war taxes or shipping supplies. These men, largely anonymous to history, bore the brunt of Edward's ambitions and Philip's anxieties. English longbowmen, in particular, would come to define the next phase of the war. Drawn from rural communities, they trained from youth, practicing archery every Sunday as required by law. Their weapon, the longbow, was cheap, devastating, and required years of muscle memory to master. French knights, on the other hand, came from the old world of chivalry. Clad in heavy armor, they saw themselves as aristocratic warriors. The looming clash between longbowmen and mounted knights would symbolize the changing nature of warfare. But in 1340, that transformation was still unfolding. For now, the war remained a slow, grinding conflict shaped more by inheritance law and supply chains than by battlefield glory. the crown as identity, legacy beyond legitimacy. Edward's pursuit of the French crown had by now transcended mere inheritance. It had become part of his identity. It reshaped how England saw itself not just as an island kingdom, but as a rightful player on the European stage. His claim also transformed French nationalism. The Valois kings, under pressure to justify their own legitimacy, began reinforcing the concept of French unity, emphasizing language, custom, and loyalty to the crown, not merely to regions or lords. Thus, the war over succession helped inadvertently sow the seeds of modern statehood. Borders, laws, centralized taxation, standing armistices all began to grow from the soil tilled by dynastic uncertainty. The Salic law, though obscure, became a political weapon, a symbol of resistance, and eventually a doctrine of national sovereignty. Unintended consequences: the war as a forge of change. What began as a legal dispute evolved into a conflict that transformed Europe. It upended feudalism, disrupted economies, and introduced new tactics, weapons, and state structures. Even in its early years, the 100 Years' War was shaping identities. England began moving toward a more centralized monarchy, with stronger parliamentary oversight. France struggled to assert central control over a fractious nobility. The idea of national kingship, kings ruling peoples and nations, not just territories, began to emerge. And yet all of this stemmed from a child born in 1328, a girl, a daughter, not a son, a birth that closed one door and opened another, a century of conflict. The open questions of dynastic fate. Now, you followed the spark of war from a dusty legal clause to the earliest campaigns of Edward's ambition. You've seen how language and law became the weapons of kings, and how ordinary men carried the weight of those decisions on their backs. But as the 1340s closed, the question of legitimacy remained unanswered. Edward had declared himself King of France, but he held no French crown. Philip VI sat in Paris, still in power, still unyielding. The battlefield would decide nothing quickly, and the world was about to change in ways no king or peasant could anticipate. Because beyond dynastic struggles, beyond sieges and taxes, a new and silent enemy was on the horizon. A plague was coming. Would the Black Death end the war or only deepen it? Story 2, Edward III, the ambitious claimant. The making of a monarch. You're standing in the shadow of a turbulent court in the year 1327. A young boy just 14 years old has been crowned King of England. His name is Edward III, and he is a monarch born into a political storm. His father, Edward II, has been deposed and murdered under suspicious conditions. His mother, Isabella of France, is the power behind the throne, ruling in partnership with her lover and co-regent, Roger Mortimer. The boy wears the crown, but it is not yet his to wield. In this early period, Edward is more of a pawn than a prince's presence necessary, his will suppressed. Yet from these constrained beginnings, something formidable begins to grow. Edward is watching, waiting, learning. And in time, he will become one of the most ambitious and aggressive monarchs in England's history, claiming not only his own throne, but that of France as well. But before ambition can flower, he must first survive the tangled politics of his own household. Isabella and Mortimer, regency in all but name. Isabella, Edward's mother, had orchestrated the deposition of her husband, Edward II, in 1327. Though often romanticized or vilified in historical accounts, Isabella's motivations were largely pragmatic. Edward II had alienated much of the nobility, failed in his wars with Scotland, and allowed royal favorites, most notoriously the Despencer, to dominate court affairs. With her son crowned and Mortimer elevated, Isabella became the de facto ruler of England. Her rule was both bold and controversial. She negotiated peace with Scotland, an unpopular treaty that recognized Scottish independence, rewarded her followers lavishly, including Mortimer, who styled himself the Earl of March, and ruled as though he were king himself. To many nobles, this was merely a regime change, not a restoration of justice. The boy king remained in the background, a silent symbol of unity while true power played out behind him. Yet even then, Edward was growing restless. The silent education of a young king. History often overlooks the subtleties of royal education. We imagine tutors with dusty books and long hours of Latin and law, but for Edward, the lessons were political. He observed the regency court's power plays, the rewards given to sycophants, the punishments for dissent. He watched Mortimer consolidate control with alarming speed, and he saw his mother-aunt, a noble queen consort, become increasingly dependent on her lover for rule. These were formative years, and they left Edward with a deep suspicion of overmighty subjects and a clear determination to rule in his own name. He learned that power not seized is power lost, and that no crown is secure while another wears it in practice. By 1330, at just 17 years old, he made his move. The coup at Nottingham Castle. On a dark night in October 1330, Edward II Istil, technically a minor, gathered a small band of loyalists and entered Nottingham Castle, where Mortimer and Isabella were staying. What happened that night was swift and bloodless. Through a secret tunnel known as the Mortimer's Hole, Edward and his men entered the castle, arrested Mortimer, and declared him a traitor. His mother was placed under house arrest. Mortimer was executed without trial. The boy king was now king in truth. This was not just a transfer of power, it was a symbolic moment. Edward had liberated himself from the shadow of regents, and in doing so, he declared his independence as a ruler. He would not be manipulated. He would not be ruled by others, and he would shape the realm as he saw fit. Restoring royal authority. Edward's early reign was characterized by careful consolidation. He moved cautiously but confidently, reinstating nobles who had been alienated during his father's and mother's regimes, and restoring trust in the monarchy. He emphasized order, justice, and stability, traits that had been lacking in the previous decades. But even as he rebuilt internally, external challenges loomed. In Scotland, King David II, the son of Robert the Bruce, challenged English authority along the northern border. In France, Edward's lingering claims to the Duchy of Gascony sparked diplomatic tension with the new French monarch, Philip VI, who viewed Edward as a subordinate, not an equal. Edward, ever patient, allowed these tensions to rise slowly. He sought not to avoid conflict, but to justify it, make his eventual moves appear righteous, not reckless. Marriage in the royal household. In 1328, Edward married Philippa of Hainault, a politically strategic union that strengthened his ties to the Low Countries. While many royal marriages of the period were cold and formal, Edward and Philippa's relationship was notably warm. She was intelligent, supportive, and a capable administrator in her own right. Philippa would go on to bear him 13 children, including the famed Edward the Black Prince. Their marriage brought stability to the royal household and helped Edward project a powerful image of continuity and legitimacy. This domestic harmony also strengthened Edward's international alliances. Hainault, Flanders, and other regions of the Low Countries would become key partners in the early stages of the 100 Years' War. Claiming the crown of France. The spark of war did not come immediately. Edward spent his first few years as ruler focusing on internal reforms and political recovery, but his attention gradually turned to France. The death of Charles IV in 1328 left the French throne without a direct male heir. As the grandson of Philip IV of France, Edward had a credible claim through his mother, but this claim had been rejected by the French nobles, citing Salic law, which barred inheritance through the female line. Edward initially paid homage to Philip VI to maintain peace, but this act rankled. As Philip began to support Scotland against England and interfered in Gascon affairs, Edward's resentment deepened. By 1337, Edward made a fateful decision. He would revive his claim to the French throne not just as a legal argument, but as a call to arms. The 100 Years' War had begun. A different kind of king. What distinguished Edward III from his predecessors was not merely his ambition, but his strategic mind. He was no idealist. He understood that legitimacy required more than bloodlines. It required military strength, popular support, and political theater. He embraced chivalric ideals, reviving the concept of the Arthurian king, creating the Order of the Garter in 1348, and encouraging tournaments and knightly culture. These were not empty gestures. They were calculated efforts to bind the nobility to his cause and foster loyalty in a kingdom still healing from internal fractures. His reign marked a shift. England was no longer a realm in recovery. It was a nation on the march. The ambition that defined a century. As you listen to this calm march through the corridors of power, you begin to understand the weight of Edward's decisions. He could have been content to stabilize England. He could have allowed the Valois to rule France without challenge. He could have retreated from Gascony and abandoned the ancient claims of the Plantagenets. But Edward was not a caretaker king. He was a builder of legacies, a monarch with the rare combination of personal ambition and political patience. His claim to the French throne may have been born from legal nuance, but it was sustained by will, calculation, and a deeply cultivated image of righteous rule. Still, ambition is a double-edged sword. Edward's wars would drain his treasury, test his people, and embroil England in a conflict that spanned generations. He had made his kingdom a contender, but at what cost? The unfinished monarch. In this opening phase of Edward's story, you witness a king being forged through betrayal, strategy, and aspiration. His early reign was not marked by great victories or famous battles, but by foundational choices that would echo across Europe for a century. Yet one question remains suspended in the air. Could Edward have known what he was unleashing? Did he believe that claiming the French crown would secure his legacy, or was he chasing a glory no mortal king could truly hold? From monarch to military commander. By 1337, Edward III had cast the die. He was no longer just the sovereign of England. He was now the self-declared king of France, a title both symbolic and incendiary. This wasn't simply a claim to a throne across the Channel. It was a rejection of the Valois monarchy, a challenge to the sovereignty of Philip VI, and a political grenade lobbed directly into the heart of European diplomacy. But making a claim and enforcing it were two very different things. Edward now had to build a coalition, rally his nobility, and perhaps most critically learn to lead an army. And so in these pivotal years, a monarch became something else altogether, a warrior king. The ties that bind, alliances across the Channel. Edward's first step was to ensure he would not fight alone. He set his sights on the Low Countries regions now within modern Belgium, and the Netherlands, where economic and political grievances with France ran deep. English wool exports were vital to the textile towns of Flanders. Any disruption to this trade, such as that caused by Philip VI's interference, risked economic ruin. In 1339, Edward secured a loose but valuable alliance with Jacques van Artevelde, the de facto ruler of Ghent. Artevelde, a merchant patrician leader, saw in Edward an opportunity to assert Flemish independence from French suzerainty. These alliances were fragile, transactional, and subject to rapid shifts, but they gave Edward something he badly needed: a foothold on the continent and a propaganda angle. If France's vassals could turn to Edward, then he was not an invader, was a liberator. Still, Edward's hold on these allies was mostly economic. and economic bonds, while useful, are rarely strong enough to win a war. First forays, the campaigns of 1339 and 1340. With his continental coalition in place, Edward launched his first military campaigns into northern France. These early efforts were indecisive, strategically confused, and logistically troubled. In 1339, Edward marched into the north with the intent of drawing Philip VI into battle. But the French king, cautious and defensive, refused open confrontation. The armies maneuvered and postured, but no battle was joined. These kinds of campaigns, full of movement but absent of combat, may seem pointless, but in the medieval world, they were often part of a longer game, testing enemy strength, forcing economic strain, and building legitimacy by presence. In 1340, Edward returned with a naval campaign, culminating in the Battle of Sluys, where he destroyed the French fleet, giving England command of the English Channel. Yet for all this, the crown of France remained out of reach. The chivalric revival, Edward's political stagecraft. Edward III understood that war was not just about swords and siege towers. It was about image. His campaigns were as much performances as they were military operations. To that end, Edward became the great revivalist of chivalry. He resurrected the code of knightly virtue, organized lavish tournaments, and cultivated an image of Arthurian nobility. This was not empty pageantry, it was calculated political theater. His efforts culminated in 1348 with the creation of the Order of the Garter, the most prestigious chivalric order in England's history. Its founding myth revolved around honor, humility, and elite brotherhood, a symbol of Edward's ideal court. By presenting himself as a just and noble king, Edward differentiated himself from Philip VI, who was increasingly portrayed in English propaganda as a pretender and manipulator of law. Even as the war grew more brutal, Edward's public persona remained steeped in romanticized heroism. It was a mask, but a useful one. Philippa's role, queen and administrator. While Edward was campaigning abroad, Queen Philippa of Hainault often governed in his stead. Her role is frequently underplayed in historical narratives, but she was a competent and diplomatic regent. She calmed internal disputes, kept the royal household functional, and secured loyalty among the English nobility. When Edward left her pregnant and responsible for the realm, she didn't just maintain order, she cemented the monarchy's stability. Philippa's legacy also lived on in her children, most notably Edward, the Black Prince, who would grow into one of the most successful commanders of the 100 Years' War. Through Philippa, the Plantagenet line was not only strengthened, it was secured for a generation to come. The road to Creasy, a king preparing for war. By the early 1340s, Edward had learned from his missteps. His military strategy evolved. He shifted from indecisive coalition warfare to more focused chevauchée-swift, destructive raids into enemy territory designed to disrupt the French economy and provoke battle. He also developed the use of combined arms, longbowmen, dismounted knights, and disciplined formations. English armies became leaner, more mobile, and more dangerous. These innovations would soon be tested in one of the most famous battles of medieval Europe, Creasy, in 1346. But before that climactic confrontation, Edward had to unite his command, move his armies across hostile terrain, and confront a superior French force. The stakes were enormous, not just for territory, but for the very idea of whether his claim to the French crown could be validated by victory. The lessons of a reluctant war. At this stage of his reign, Edward III's ambitions were bold but tempered by experience. He had faced failed campaigns, fickle allies, and stretched finances, and yet he persisted. He no longer believed in swift victory. He had come to understand that a crown won through inheritance might take decades to seize by force. His reign now took on the rhythm of long conflict, War, truce, diplomacy, taxation, recruitment, war again. It is easy to look back on Edward as a confident warlord, but at this stage the outcome was far from assured. His armies were still smaller, his finances still weaker. France was still richer and more populous. But Edward had something the Valois lacked, a clear narrative. He was the king wronged, the heir denied. And with each raid, each alliance, and each declaration, he pushed that story further into the consciousness of his kingdom. Banners on the horizon. As 1346 approached, Edward gathered his most loyal commanders and planned his boldest campaign yet. An invasion of Normandy, with the goal of striking directly into the heart of France. This would not be a raid or a border conflict. This would be a statement of force. In this period, you see the full transformation of Edward from boy king to military monarch. The lessons learned through personal betrayal, political isolation, and early failure had produced a leader of rare resilience. Still, the road ahead remained uncertain. Could this warrior king finally force Philip VI into open battle? Would the upcoming campaign settle the question of legitimacy, or would it simply entrench a war with no end? A campaign with a purpose. The year was 1346. Edward III was no longer testing the waters of war. He was preparing for full immersion. Years of minor campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, and tentative truces had taught him the mechanics of conflict. Now, he would apply those lessons in full. The Normandy campaign was not just another raid, it was a statement. This was Edward's longest, most coordinated military venture yet, involving tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of ships, and months of strategic preparation. It would culminate in one of the most defining battles of the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Creasy. But Creasy didn't begin on a battlefield. It began with a carefully chosen landing site, a scorched path through Normandy, and a calculated plan to provoke Philip VI into open combat. The chevauchée through Normandy. Edward landed in Cotentin, near St. Vaast-la-Hougue, in July 1346. From there, he launched a massive chevauchée scorched earth campaign designed to terrorize the countryside, loot resources, and destabilize enemy morale. His army marched through Valognes, Carentan, Saint-Lô, Caen, and onward, burning as they went. Churches, granaries, and homes were destroyed. It was brutal and efficient. Unlike the rigid feudal conflicts of the 13th century, this new warfare targeted economic infrastructure, a war against the land itself. Why? Because Edward needed Philip VI to respond, and nothing drew kings to battle like the devastation of their realm. But Edward had to move carefully. His army was deep in enemy territory, his supply lines thin. He had to keep marching north toward Flanders, where he hoped to meet with Allied reinforcements. And all the while, Philip VI was gathering a massive force to intercept him. It was a game of time, and Terinand Edward knew exactly where he wanted to end it. The road to Creasy, positioning for advantage. Edward eventually reached the River Somme, only to find it blocked by French forces. He needed a crossing, and Fastai's men were tired, and the French army was closing in. At last, near the village of Blanchetac, Edward's forces found a ford. They crossed after a fierce skirmish and finally reached Crécy-en-Ponthieu. Here, Edward stopped running. He chose a defensive position on a ridge, placing longbowmen on either flank, with dismounted knights in the center. It was a textbook example of prepared terrain advantage. Edward's army was outnumbered but not outmatched. He had discipline, planning, and positioning. On August 26, 1346, the Battle of Creasy began. Creasy, discipline over valor. The French army, led by Philip VI, was vast. Estimates range from 30,000 to 40,000 men. Edward's force was perhaps half that, but numbers alone did not decide medieval battles. Philip's army was exhausted. They had rushed to meet Edward, marching hundreds of miles in oppressive August heat. His forces were also disorganized. The French command structure was fragmented, with powerful nobles each eager to lead the charging few willing to listen. In contrast, Edward's troops were well-rested and tightly coordinated. He positioned his longbowmen trained English and Welsh archers in a formation that would devastate any direct cavalry assault. The French opened the battle with their Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries who had been poorly supplied and forced to march without their equipment wagons. As they advanced, it began to rain, and their crossbows, lacking the protective gear needed to stay dry, became ineffective. The English longbowmen, whose yew bows functioned even in wet conditions, unleashed volleys of arrows, a mechanical, thunderous rain of death. The Genoese broke ranks. Philip, enraged, ordered his own knights to cut them down for cowardice. Then came the full-scale French cavalry charge. The power of the longbow. What happened next changed the psychology of warfare. The French knights charged uphill, directly into a barrage of longbow fire. Horses collapsed under them. Riders were pinned down and suffocated. The rain of arrows didn't pierce every suit of armor, but it did maim, disorient, and slow the attackers. Then the English infantry moved in. Wave after wave of French knights attempted to breach Edward's line. Each time, they were pushed back, sometimes literally over piles of their own dead. By evening, the French were in total disarray. Philip himself was wounded and barely escaped. Among the many nobles slain was John of Bohemia, a blind king who had fought valiantly, but was slaughtered alongside his retainers. The cost to France was catastrophic. Creasy was not just a defeat, it was a humiliation. A shift in power. Creasy established Edward III as not merely a claimant, but a conqueror. It validated his tactics, vindicated his claim in the eyes of his supporters, and proved that the mighty Valois monarchy could be beaten. In the aftermath, Edward moved north and laid siege to Calais, a critical port city, which would fall to the English after a grueling 11-month siege. Calais would remain in English hands for over 2 centuries, becoming a vital foothold on the continent. With these victories, Edward's position had fundamentally changed. He was now no longer a foreign upstart. He was a king with lands, legitimacy, and legacy. The Black Prince, a new generation emerges. Among those who fought at Creasy was Edward's eldest son, Edward of Woodstock, later known as the Black Prince. Only 16 at the time, he commanded a section of the battlefield with notable discipline. When his line wavered, messengers rode to his father asking for reinforcements. Edward famously refused, saying, "Let the boy earn his spurs." The younger Edward did just that. Creasy became not just the triumph of a king, but the birth of a legend. The Black Prince would go on to become one of the most feared commanders of the Warhigh's reputation, forged in the crucible of his father's ambition. Crown, coin, and cost. Despite his victories, Edward faced enormous challenges. War was draining England's treasury. Parliament grew wary of perpetual campaigns. Trade suffered. Taxes increased. And the most devastating force was yet to come. By 1348, the Black Death arrived in England, cutting down as much as 1/3 of the population. Even Edward's own household was struck. War halted, and the kingdom turned inward. Yet even in crisis, Edward's claim remained. His victories at Sluys, Creasy, and Calais cemented his reputation. He was the king who had dared to challenge France and won. The warrior king's paradox. Edward III's reign was a paradox. He was a builder of institutions, a lover of law and order, yet also a man of unrelenting war. He revived English chivalry and knighthood, yet relied on brutal scorched-earth tactics. He sought legitimacy through law, yet pursued it by the sword. And still, the crown of France eluded him. For all his victories, Edward would never sit on the French throne. His claim, passed to his descendants, would drag England into war after war for over 100 years. But his legacy was lasting. Edward III reshaped England into a militarized monarchy, forged the image of kingship in battle, and planted seeds of national consciousness long before nationalism had a name. Legacy beyond the crown. In the end, Edward III was not remembered simply for what he conquered, but for what he created. A dynasty fortified by war. An image of kingship built on valor and vision. A legacy passed to a son, then to a nation. And yet one question remains. What might have happened if Edward had taken Paris, not just Calais? If he had claimed the French crown in practice, not just in heraldry? Would France and England have become one kingdom, or would the union have torn them both apart from within? Story 3. The Siege of Calais. Hunger, walls, and civic strain. Calais, a city between kingdoms. The city of Calais, perched on the northern coast of France, was not a grand metropolis. It was not the seat of kings or the home of cathedrals, but it was a port, a well-fortified one, just 21 miles across the English Channel. In the 14th century, Calais was a gateway between England and the continent, between trade and war. By the summer of 1346, Calais had become more than a waypoint. It was a target and soon a prison. When Edward III began his siege, the city's fate became intertwined with his ambition. Fresh from his stunning victory at Creasy, he marched northward, not back to England, but toward this fortified town, intent on securing a permanent foothold in France. He would get it, but not with swords or charges. The battle for Calais would be a war of attrition, and it would reveal the dull but deadly mechanics of siegecraft in the Middle Ages. Why Calais? At first glance, Calais was not the obvious next move. It wasn't the richest or largest city in France. But for Edward, it was the perfect port for a long-term English base on the continent. Its proximity to England meant easy resupply. Its deep harbor allowed the reception of large ships. Its location near Flanders, where Edward had forged alliances, gave him logistical flexibility. And crucially, Calais was well defended, but not impregnable. Edward needed more than a battlefield triumph to press his claim to the French throne. He needed land, leverage, and longevity. Calais offered all three. A siege begins. The Siege of Calais began in September 1346, just weeks after Creasy. Edward's army encamped around the city, cutting off roads and surrounding the land approaches. He knew the city couldn't be taken by direct assault, not without staggering losses. Its walls were thick, its garrison strong, and the defenders well supplied at first. Instead, Edward chose patience. He built siege works, dug trenches, and constructed a fortified camp of timber and earthworks, complete with a market, houses, and even a chapel. Chroniclers described it as a city outside the city. He was not going to leave until Calais, surrender it or starved. Life inside, civic strain and resource management. Calais was not prepared for a siege of this length. Though it had ample defenses and stores, the city was not provisioned for an extended blockade. Its population, around 7,000, including civilians, was soon placed under enormous pressure. Food supplies dwindled. Salted meats and hard grains were rationed. Wells were watched constantly for contamination. The town's leadership, led by Jean de Vienne, a seasoned and respected commander, organized regular patrols and maintained morale as best they could. But no matter how disciplined the defense, time was not on their side. Hunger does what arrows cannot. It gnaws at loyalty, breeds despair, and slowly erodes the will to resist. The sea lifeline and naval blockade. Calais' only true hope lay in the sea. As long as the port remained accessible, French ships could resupply the city. And indeed, early in the siege, vessels from Boulogne and the Low Countries slipped through English lines with grain, wine, and salted fish. Edward knew this had to end. So in the spring of 1347, he established a naval blockade, placing ships at the harbor mouth and constructing a network of watch posts and signal systems. He even built a floating boom across the harbor to stop ships from entering. It was the choke point that turned a siege into starvation. The French crown made attempts to break the blockade. A major relief force was assembled in 1347, but as weeks turned to months, Philip VI hesitated. His treasury was depleted. His nobility was divided. His authority had been shaken by Creasy. The king arrived too late and with too little. A city starving. By July 1347, the siege had dragged on for nearly a year. Inside Calais, conditions had become dire. Dogs and cats were eaten. Grass was boiled for soup. Leather belts were softened and chewed. Eyewitness accounts describe corpses in the streets, buried hastily in mass graves. Disease began to spread. Morale crumbled. Jean de Vienne sent multiple pleas to the French crown, but Philip VI could note would not risk a full-scale engagement with Edward again. Then came the hardest decision, to surrender the city. But Edward demanded not just capitulation. He wanted a symbol, a human act of submission. The burghers of Calais. According to the chronicler Jean Froissart, Edward demanded that 6 leading citizens, or burghers, of Calais present themselves to him bareheaded, barefoot, and wearing only their undergarments, with ropes around their neck, symbols of submission and execution. They were to bring the keys of the city and offer themselves for death, in exchange for sparing the rest. It was a cruel and calculated gesture. Edward wanted to make a point that even after victory he had the right to punish. 6 citizens came forward, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, a wealthy merchant. They walked out of the city as ordered, expecting death. But here the narrative shifts. Queen Philippa of Hainault, pregnant and moved by compassion, reportedly begged Edward for mercy. Her plea, delivered in public, gave Edward a chance to temper justice with clemency. He spared their lives. Whether the story is entirely true or a literary invention, it reflects a tension in Edward's reign, the balance between ruthless king and chivalric sovereign. The cost of taking a city. After the surrender, Calais was emptied. The French population was expelled, men, women, and children alike. New English settlers were brought in. The city was refortified, rebuilt, and garrisoned. Calais was now an English city, the only one England would hold in France continuously until 1558. It became a vital base for trade, military campaigns, and diplomacy. English kings referred to it as the brightest jewel in the crown of France. But it came at a cost. A year-long siege drained England's coffers. Thousands of soldiers died from disease and exposure. The civilian toll was immense, though less bloody than a pitched battle. It was no less brutal. Siege warfare in its slow grind reveals the banality of war. No great charges, no epic duels, just hunger, walls, and the slow collapse of hope. Calais and the legacy of occupation. The English occupation of Calais reshaped the region. Trade shifted. Smuggling routes blossomed. It became a symbol of Anglo-French rivalry, a city always on the edge of war. But perhaps more than anything, Calais became a lesson in military patience. Edward did not win it with heroism, but with infrastructure, discipline, and time. For modern listeners, this may seem dry, a year of waiting, digging, and rationing. But in that dullness lies something deeper, a test of human endurance, of both the besieged and the besiegers. And one wonders, if Philip VI had arrived in time with a strong relief army, could the siege have been broken? Could Calais have remained French and altered the path of the war entirely? The machinery of patience. By the early months of 1347, the siege of Calais was no longer a headline event, it was a daily grind. The novelty of military campaign had worn off. Soldiers did not wake to battle cries, but to the monotony of watch rotations, wall inspections, and ration inventories. Siege warfare in the 14th century was less a matter of sudden violence and more an exercise in endurance engineering. It was a game of time, tools, and terrain. Edward III's camp had evolved into a military city, with smiths, carpenters, quartermasters, and clergy all dedicated to a single purpose: wait the enemy out. Yet within this apparent stillness, logistical genius was at work. How to starve a city? To starve a city, you must first understand it. Calais, like most medieval towns, relied on regular trade for survival. The countryside around it was modestly productive, but could not sustain the garrison and civilian population during a siege. That meant all food had to come by sea. Edward's command knew this. Their siege tactics reflected a multi-layered strategy. Encirclement, land approaches were blockaded with trenches, earthworks, and palisades. Watchtowers dotted the horizon, connected by patrols. Naval blockades, ships from the Cinque Ports, England's naval strongholds, joined Edward's own fleet to seal off the port. A floating barrier, part chain, part boom, was constructed across the harbor mouth. Scouting and intercepting. Intercepted French supply convoys were seized or sunk. Watchers along the coast raised alarms when sails were sighted. Every tactic was geared toward breaking the supply chain. It was a war waged with Huguenot swords. The English camp, life outside the walls. Edward's siege camp was one of the most advanced military encampments of the period. Chroniclers describe it with near-awe: rows of tents and timber structures arranged by unit, nationality, and rank. A market operated inside the camp, with merchants permitted and taxed to sell goods to soldiers. There were blacksmiths for arrow making, ovens for bread, and even a church built of wood and canvas, where Edward worshipped regularly. His tent served as both military headquarters and royal court. Interestingly, discipline was strict. Looting, brawling, and desertion were punished harshly. Soldiers were expected to follow orders and keep to routine. Unlike other medieval camps, which often descended into chaos during long sieges, Edward remained a model of order. The army wasn't just waiting, they were maintaining pressure. The French response: hesitation and fracture. Inside the walls of Calais, Jean de Vienne held out hope. He knew that Edward's army, far from home and exposed to the elements, could not remain forever. Relief, he believed, would come. But relief required a decision from Philip V. Ian Philip vacillated. After the debacle at Creasy, the French king was cautious. His nobility was fractured, finances were in disarray, and calls for large-scale levies were met with resistance. Towns refused taxes. Nobles refused to raise arms. It was not until July 1347, nearly a year into the siege, that Philip finally assembled a relief army. Estimates suggest he brought over 50,000 men, a vast force by the standards of the time. But when they arrived near Calais, they found the terrain fortified and unwelcoming. Edward had blocked the landward approaches and controlled the sea. French scouts reported no weak points. Philip, confronted with the realities of Edward's siege network, chose not to engage. He withdrew. Inside Calais, hope died that day. Siege engine, sappers, and walls. Though starvation was the primary weapon, Edward did not ignore the traditional elements of siegecraft. His engineers brought siege engines, including trebuchets, capable of launching stones and firepots; ballistae for long-range bolt fire; mantlets and towers for use in an assault, though these were never deployed. More importantly, Edward employed sapper-tunnel diggers who attempted to undermine the walls by digging beneath them, then collapsing the tunnels to bring down masonry. These were dangerous and grueling jobs, often done by miners from Wales or northern England, paid extra for the risk. However, Calais' defenders were vigilant. Countermines were dug. Boiling pitch and smoke were used to flush out sappers. In the end, most tunnels were discovered and neutralized. Still, even failed mining operations had a purpose. They kept the garrison constantly engaged, wearing them down psychologically. The toll on the garrison. By the spring of 1347, conditions in Calais were catastrophic. Food rations fell to 2 ounces of bread a day. Rats, dogs, and leather were boiled for meals. Disease, particularly dysentery and typhus, began to spread. Jean de Vienne ordered non-combatants expelled women, children, the elderly. This was a common medieval tactic to conserve food and reduce strain, but Edward refused to let them pass. Hundreds of starving civilians, too weak to return to the countryside, were trapped between the walls and the English lines. They died in limbo, exposed and forgotten. It was a cruelty not of action, but of inaction. And in this moment, you see siege warfare for what it truly was. A war on society, not just soldiers. The human cost of patience. Historians often note that the siege of Calais caused fewer battlefield deaths than Creasy, but that does not mean it was less bloody. The suffering was simply slower. Death came not from swords, but from silence. Inside the city, thousands perished from starvation or illness. The urban economy collapsed. Social order erodriates were narrowly averted. Outside the city, Edward's army lost men to exposure, disease, and accidents. Supplies had to be constantly shipped from England. Horses died en masse, requiring regular replacements. This was not a heroic war. It was a managerial nightmare, a logistical labyrinth in which human lives were units of endurance. And yet Edward held his line. He never broke siege. He never retreated. And in doing so, he reshaped English military doctrine for generations. Crisis and surrender. In July 1347, with no food, no reinforcements, and no prospect of relief, Jean de Vienne offered surrender. Edward's demands were heavy. He wanted hostages, the keys to the city, and unconditional access. The burghers, including Eustache de Saint-Pierre, stepped forward ready to die so others might live. The spectacle of submission was designed to send a message to all of France. Resist Edward, and this is your fate. But as we saw in Section 1, Queen Philippa intervened. The burghers were spared. What was not spared was Calais' identity. Occupation and transformation. Immediately after surrender, Edward expelled the French population of Calais. Some were deported inland. Others vanished into the countryside. Their homes and shops were turned over to English settlers, mostly from Kent, London, and the Cinque Ports. Over the next year, Edward spent vast sums to rebuild the fortifications, expand the harbor, install a permanent English garrison, create a colonial-style administration under English law. Calais became an island of Englishness in Francia, a symbol of dominance, and an enduring wedge between the two kingdoms. Its transformation wasn't just military, it was cultural. The siege in memory. The siege of Calais became a legend, not for its battles, but for its symbolism. The burghers of Calais, immortalized by Rawdon centuries later, became an emblem of civic sacrifice. Edward III, with Calais in hand, became the first English king since William the Conqueror to permanently hold continental soil. Yet the siege also raised troubling questions. Was Edward's patience brilliance or cruelty? Did Calais strengthen the English position or overextend it? What price did both sides pay for a city that, in the end, was more strategic than sacred? The aftermath of victory. When the gates of Calais opened in August 1347, it marked the end of a siege that had lasted nearly 11 months. Unlike the clash at Creasy, which had been swift and decisive, this victory was a slow strangulation, a war of attrition waged through supply lines and suffering. For Edward III, the siege was a masterclass in military persistence. But what followed was more than the conclusion of a campaign. Calais would become the linchpin of English continental ambition, a colonial stronghold embedded within hostile territory. This final phase of the story is not one of battle, but of occupation, governance, and transformation, slow, deliberate remaking of a city into something new, and the uncomfortable legacy left behind. The Englishification of Calais. Immediately after the surrender, Edward moved swiftly to reshape Calais into an English possession not merely occupied, but owned. He ordered the expulsion of the entire French population, a rare but not unheard of practice in medieval warfare. Chroniclers describe townspeople forced from their homes, given little time to collect belongings, and herded beyond the city walls. Some resettled in nearby towns like Boulogne or Saint-Omer, while others disappeared into the countryside. In their place, Edward installed English settlers, mainly from Kent, Sussex, and the Cinque Ports, alongside merchants from London and Bristol. These new residents were promised tax incentives, land grants, and royal protection. With them came English law, English coinage, and English customs. Calais was no longer a French town under English control. It became, in every sense, an English colony. A fortress on the continent. Edward was under no illusions about the vulnerability of his new prize. Calais sat deep in hostile territory. Without proper defenses, it would be retaken. So he poured immense resources into its fortification. The town walls were reinforced and extended. A citadel was constructed at the heart of the city. New gates and towers were added, including the famous Lanterne des Dames. The harbor was dredged and deepened to accommodate English warships. An English garrison of nearly 1,000 men-at-arms and archers was stationed permanently. The town became the headquarters for operations in northern France and a vital link in the supply chain for future campaigns. More than a city, Calais was now a military bastion, one that would remain under English control for over 2 centuries. Trade, economy, and the Pale of Calais. In the years following the siege, Calais quickly evolved into a commercial hub. The town sat at the crossroads of English, Flemish, and French trade, making it ideal for merchants and middlemen. Edward established the staple of Calais in the 1360 trading monopoly, whereby all English wool exports had to pass through the city. This made Calais the financial heart of English cloth trade and significantly enriched both the crown and the city's merchants. To support agriculture and shipping, Edward also created the Pale of Calais, a stretch of surrounding countryside approximately 6 miles deep. Though often insecure, it provided food, timber, and a defensive buffer. The Pale was patrolled constantly, its boundaries marked by ditches and outposts. It became a fragile frontier, never truly French, never fully English. The siege in English memory. While the English saw Calais as a triumph, the memory of the siege remained a symbol of English cruelty to the French. The burghers of Calais, who offered themselves to Edward in exchange for the lives of their townsfolk, became immortalized in French folklore as martyrs of civic virtue. Their story, embellished over time, became a national allegory for resistance and dignity under occupation. In the 19th century, French sculptor Auguste Rodin famously captured their moment of sacrifice in his sculpture The Burghers of Calais, a monument to the emotional weight of the siege, long after its military importance had faded. In English memory, Calais was prized but not romanticized. It was an asset, a strategic achievement born not of glory, but of grim determination. Even Shakespeare, who dramatized Edward III in apocryphal plays, did not focus heavily on Calais, perhaps because its story, however important, lacked the grandeur of battlefield heroism. Diplomatic fallout and the Truce of Calais. With Calais in English hands and Philip VI reeling, both sides were exhausted. The loss of the city was devastating for the French crown not just militarily, but symbolically. It shattered any illusion that England's claim to France was a bluff. Under pressure from the Pope and European monarchs, a truce was negotiated in late 1347. Known as the Truce of Calais, it formally paused hostilities, though it did not resolve the dynastic dispute. The truce was extended multiple times, lasting intermittently for nearly a decade. It allowed both kingdoms to recover but also to rearm. And then, in 1348, came a greater enemy than any army. The Black Death. War gives way to plague. As Edward was settling his new city, reports began to filter in from the south. A great pestilence was moving northward through Europe. Within months, it arrived in Calais. The siege had ended, but the city, crowded, unsanitary, and recently resettled, was perfectly primed for infection. The Black Death struck Calais hard. Mortality rates are impossible to quantify, but it is likely that 30% to 50% of the population perished. The garrison suffered. The merchants died in their homes. Ships from England carried the disease back across the Channel, spreading it to London, Bristol, and beyond. The war paused, not from truce but from terror. Edward's long view. Even as the plague ravaged his realm, Edward held on to Calais. He sent new settlers, rebuilt trade routes, and made the city the official seat of the English wool staple. To him, it was a long-term investment, a beachhead for future conquest. And in many ways he was right. Calais gave England a launching point for future invasions, a diplomatic tool in negotiations, a source of revenue and pride. But it also became a liability and outpost constantly under threat, requiring men and money to defend. Over time, the city's strategic value would decline, even as its symbolic weight grew. The enduring legacy of the sea. The Siege of Calais teaches us little about the glory of war, and much about its texture, its costs, its consequences, and its quiet devastations. It was a war fought in slow motion, where hunger did the killing. It was a turning point in medieval logistics, engineering, and military planning. It was a moment where kings showed both relentlessness and restraint. And in its outcome, we see how war is not always won by brilliance, but by persistence. A final reflection. Calais would remain English until 1558, outlasting Edward III by nearly 2 centuries. Its loss would later be mourned by Queen Mary I, who is said to have declared, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." But for Edward, Calais was never sentimental. It was functional, it was earned, and it was kept. Yet one wonders, had the French broken the siege in 1347, would Edward's reputation as a military strategist have endured? Would the 100 years, war have slowed, perhaps even ended without an English stronghold on French soil? History rarely answers these questions, but it leaves them behind, like footprints in sand, eroded but not erased. Story 4, Black Monday, the storm that killed an army. A pause in war, a push for peace. By the year 1360, the 100 Years' War had already stretched over 2 decades. England had seen its golden moment under Edward III, with victories at Creasy, Calais, and most recently Poitiers, where the French King John II was taken prisoner and transported to London. But werven triumphant, whereas expensive. Tax burdens were mounting in England. Disease had ravaged both armies and populations, and there was a sense, faint but growing, that perhaps the bloodshed had run its course. Still, peace had to be made on favorable terms, and so, in April of 1360, Edward III led one final campaign, not to fight a decisive battle but to pressure France into formal negotiation. His target, Paris. What happened next was not a clash of armies or a siege, but a storm, sudden, lethal, and remembered in history not for its strategic consequence, but for its unexpected devastation. This is the story of Black Monday, Edward's new campaign, a march to end the war. Following his stunning success at Poitiers in 1356, Edward had found himself in possession of not only a captive French king, but incredible leverage. With King John II imprisoned, France had descended into political chaos. His son, the Dauphin Charles, was attempting to govern as regent but faced resistance from both nobles and commoners. Banditry, tax revolts, and open rebellion broke out across the kingdom. Sensing an opportunity, Edward demanded an enormous ransom and territorial concessions in return for the king's release. But the French stalled, negotiations dragged on. By 1360, Edward had grown impatient. He gathered an army of over 10,000 men and crossed into northern France. The aim was not territorial conquest, but psychological pressure. Remark to the gates of Paris, show force and force France's hand. The strategy made sense, but nature had other plans. Easter Monday, 13 April 1360. As Edward's army encamped near the town of Chartres, roughly 50 miles from Paris, they prepared for a final diplomatic push. The men were confident. No significant French force opposed them. Morale was high. The land was rich. The air, unusually warm for April, was calm. And then, without warning, the sky turned. What followed would be known as Black Monday. The sky turns black. Contemporary chronicles describe the day as beginning with suffocating heat, followed by an eerie stillness. Then came the clouds, thick, fast-moving, turning day to dusk. And then the wind. But this was not just a thunderstorm. According to the Froissart Chronicles, a terrifying hailstorm erupted across the English lines. Stones the size of apples fell from the sky. Lightning struck tents and men directly. Winds whipped through the camp, collapsing shelters and flinging debris like weapons. The soldiers, many of whom had removed armor in the earlier warmth, were caught completely exposed. In a matter of minutes, hundreds were dead. Some accounts put the toll at over 1,000 men, and 6,000 horse, numbers debated by historians but consistent in their horror. This was no battle, no tactical ambush. This was the weather itself turned against an army. Panic, prayer, and superstition. To medieval minds, the storm was no natural event. It was divine wrath. Many believed it was God's punishment, perhaps for the excessive bloodshed of the war, or for Edward's arrogance in threatening the French capital during Holy Week. Edward himself was reportedly deeply shaken. He and his commanders organized mass prayers, public confessions, and religious processions. Some nobles fasted for days, believing the storm a judgment on their souls. The event did not just cripple the army physically, it demoralized them spiritually. And Edward, who had never been beaten in battle, now found himself beaten by the elements. Tactical consequences. Though the storm was brief, its effect was decisive. Edward abandoned his march on Paris almost immediately. His army, still capable of movement, turned west. Within weeks, negotiations resumed in earnest. By May 1360, the two sides signed the Treaty of Breda, a significant, though ultimately short-lived, peace agreement. Edward agreed to renounce his claim to the French crown in exchange for expanded territory, primarily in Aquitaine, a massive ransom for King John II, 3 million écus, an extraordinary sum. The treaty was hailed in England as a triumph of diplomacy and military might, but many noted, quietly, that it had only been made possible by a storm that could not be planned. A rare weather event or something more. Modern meteorologists and historians have speculated about what exactly caused the Black Monday storm. Was it a supercell thunderstorm, unusual for northern France but not impossible? Was it accompanied by a tornado, which would explain the localized destruction and reports of spiraling winds? Or was it a hailstorm intensified by an early spring warm front, colliding with cold air from the north. We may never know. Medieval chroniclers lacked the terminology to describe meteorological phenomena with precision. What they did describe was terror, confusion, and a day in which the sky itself turned hostile. For Edward and his army, it was a reminder that no matter how strong a king, no matter how seasoned a general, there were forces in this world that could not be commanded. A footnote in military history, a landmark in memory. Unlike Crécy, Poitiers, or Agincourt, Black Monday is not a famous victory. It is not studied for its tactics or its leadership. It produced no heroes, no prisoners, no grand parades. And yet it marked a turning point. It ended Edward's final major campaign in France. It led directly to one of the most significant treaties of the 100 Years' War, and it reminded both sides that even the mightiest armies are at the mercy of sky and soil. It is perhaps the most vivid example in the war's long history of how fragile it not glory often defines human endeavor. An unsettling question. The storm at Chartres was a freak event, but what if it had never come? What if Edward had reached Paris with a full, unshaken army? Would the city have fallen? Would Edward have renewed his claim to the French crown, marching not in negotiation but in conquest? Would the 100 Years' War have ended not in uneasy peace but in English dominion? Or did the storm save Paris and perhaps, in time, France itself? The calm after the chaos. In the wake of the sudden and violent storm near Chartres on 13 April 1360, Edward III's army was left stunned. The march on Paris, once intended to be a climactic show of strength, was abandoned not because of enemy action, but because of an act of nature so terrifying, so total, that it resembled divine punishment in the eyes of the 14th century mind. Edward had never been a superstitious king, not overtly, but he was a medieval one, and like all men of his time, he believed that the will of God could be made manifest in wind, fire, and sky. Thus, Black Monday did more than scatter an army. It reshaped policy, altered the king's mood, and brought urgency to long-stalled diplomacy. The war that had raged for nearly 25 years seemed, suddenly, ready to end. From weather to words, reopening negotiations. After turning his army away from Paris, Edward and his advisors moved to Chartres, where they quickly re-established diplomatic channels with the French Regency. Their mood was transformed, not defeated, but subdued. Just 1 week later, English envoys met with the French court in Braidigny, a small town near Chartres, to draft the terms of peace. It was not the first time the two kingdoms had tried to negotiate. Talks had been attempted repeatedly since the mid-1350s, especially after Edward's son, the Black Prince, captured King John II of France at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. But neither side had found the leverage or the urgency to commit. Now, with the French king still in captivity, the French countryside in chaos, and the English unnerved by divine storm, a unique moment of opportunity had emerged. On 8 May 1360, the Treaty of Braidigny was signed. Terms of the treaty: a pause, not a peace. The Treaty of Braidigny was, on paper, a major English victory. Key terms included: King Edward III would renounce his claim to the French crown. In return, France would cede vast territories to England, much of Aquitaine, Gascony, and parts of Poitou, effectively giving Edward sovereign rule over 1/3 of France. France agreed to pay a ransom of 3 million gold écus, approximately 10 years of royal revenue, for the release of King John II. A truce was agreed to, with both sides halting hostilities for several years. On the surface, it seemed that Edward had achieved what many thought impossible: peace with honor, expansion without further bloodshed, and compensation for his long war. And yet, even at the moment of signing, the fragility of the agreement was obvious. Why Edward gave up his claim? Historians have debated why Edward chose to abandon his claim to the French throne after decades of pursuit. Was it exhaustion, practicality, the influence of the storm? In truth, it was likely a combination of all three. Strategically, Edward had gained most of the territory he truly desired, particularly Aquitaine, which gave England firm control over the rich, wine-producing lands of southwestern France. Politically, his support for the French crown had weakened. Even his own barons were weary of taxation, and the outbreak of the Black Death in the late 1340s had diminished manpower. Financially, the French ransom would bring massive relief to the royal coffers. But perhaps most curiously, Black Monday seems to have marked a psychological shift in Edward. Contemporaries noted that he appeared changed afterward, not broken, but more cautious, more mortal. One must consider the possibility that, after a career of conquest, Edward had been deeply rattled by an enemy he could not anticipate or control. The fate of King John II. King John II, the captured French monarch, had been treated with surprising courtesy during his English captivity. He lived in luxury at the Savoy Palace, attended tournaments, and was allowed to hold court with French nobles. Upon his release, France hoped to resume a sense of order, but it was not so easy. In 1363, after his son, the future Charles V, failed to pay the full ransom and a key hostage escaped, John voluntarily returned to English captivity, a rare act of royal honor. He would die in London in 1364, a king who had suffered defeat, imprisonment, and disgrace, but who remained respected for his dignity. His death marked a symbolic end to one chapter of the war and the beginning of another. The Treaty undone, seeds of renewal. The Treaty of Bretagne, despite its grandeur, did not last. Several factors led to its slow collapse. Territorial disputes. Though Edward was granted sovereignty over large parts of France, the logistics of administering those territories proved deeply problematic. French vassals resented English overlordship. Laws and taxes clashed. Resistance flared. The death of Edward's heirs, the late 1360s and early 1370s, saw the weakening of Edward's inner circle. The Black Prince, Edward's most capable military leader, fell gravely ill. His younger son, Lionel of Antwerp, died suddenly. Edward himself aged poorly, and governance fell increasingly to less competent advisors. Charles V's revival. After John II's death, his son, Charles V, inherited a weakened but still defiant kingdom. He refused to accept the terms of Bretagne, refused to ratify Edward's territorial sovereignty, and slowly began to retake lost lands. By the late 1370s, full war had resumed. The Treaty of Bretagne, born in the shadow of a storm, had been a temporary truce dressed up as peace. Black Monday remembered. In the English imagination, Black Monday remained a moment of divine intervention. It was not forgotten. For decades after, Easter Monday carried a tinge of superstition. Chronicles referred to it as the day the sky punished pride. Soldiers told tales of hailstones killing men like arrows. Some claimed that Edward wept openly. Others said he vowed never to threaten Paris again. The event even entered legal history. In later centuries, English courts occasionally cited acts of God, a phrase born, in part, from days like Black Monday, where fate intervened and removed human agency. Storms in the mind and in the state. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Black Monday is not its death toll, but its suddenness. In a war shaped by siege engines, cavalry, and diplomacy, here was a reminder that power is precarious, that even the most disciplined army can be shattered not by strategy or betrayal, but by a shift in the sky. Edward had built his career on careful timing, relentless patience, and martial strength, but even he, at the height of his power, found himself humbled by the unseen hand of nature. It is no coincidence that his foreign ambitions cooled after 1360, though the war would continue by his sons, and later his grandson Edward would never again march on Paris. Unanswered questions in the aftermath. Had the Treaty of Breda succeeded, the 100 Years' War might have ended then and there. England would have kept its vast holdings. France would have restructured itself around a reduced core. The dynastic claims might have been buried, and an uneasy peace allowed to calcify into permanence. But it was not to be. The lands gained were hard to govern. The truce was hard to enforce. The Weatherants again had given a pause, not a solution. So we're left to wonder. Did the storm prevent a greater disaster or merely delay it? Was it divine mercy or divine warning? Or was it simply the sky, indifferent to kings and causes alike? The storm's long shadow. In the long tapestry of the 100 Years' War, certain events echo louder than other epic battles, legendary commanders, diplomatic betrayals. But some events whisper rather than roar. Black Monday, the freak storm that struck Edward III's army on April 1360, left no triumph, no trophy, and no tale of heroism. And yet it reshaped strategy, stalled a campaign, and ushered in one of the war's rare attempts at peace. Even as the soldiers buried the dead and the tents were repitched, a quiet truth settled over Edward's camp. The greatest force in the field had not been French steel, but the sky itself. And that truth disquieting, uncontainable, would cast its shadow across the decades to come. A monarch transformed. For a king who had risen to power through assertiveness, ambition, and martial vision, the events of Black Monday struck a personal chord. Edward III was no stranger to hardship. He had overthrown his mother's regency, survived rebellions, and orchestrated battlefield triumphs. But this storm marked the first time he had been wholly powerless, where no general's counsel or siege work could defend his men. According to later accounts, the king was seen kneeling in the wet grass, praying in the middle of the chaos, his cloak soaked and his crown unsteady. Though such scenes may have been embellished, they reflect a broader perception. Edward had been humbled not by men, but by something older and greater. Following the storm, Edward's tone in negotiations with the French changed. He became more pragmatic, more willing to compromise. His final campaigns would no longer be about grand marches to Paris, but about consolidating English control in Aquitaine and maintaining the peace he had bled for. The mythos of Black Monday. In the decades following, Black Monday entered the cultural record of the 100 Years' War, not with glory, but with a sort of haunted reverence. English chroniclers like Thomas Walsingham and Henry Knighton wrote of the event in biblical terms. It seemed the heavens opened and let forth a fury reserved for judgment alone. Among common soldiers, tales were passed on of comrades struck dead mid-stride, of horses rising in the air, of entire units drowned in mud and hail. Whether or not these reports were true, they reinforced a growing sense that God's favor was conditional and unpredictable. In a deeply religious age, such interpretations mattered. They colored how future campaigns were planned, how kings portrayed themselves, and how chaplains addressed their flocks. The war was no longer only between England and France. It had a third, silent participant, Providence. The unspoken impact on military doctrine. While the immediate effects of the storm were spiritual and diplomatic, its tactical repercussions were also felt. After 1360, English commanders grew more cautious in their campaign timing. Long marches in spring, when weather was unstable, became less frequent. Greater attention was paid to camp fortification, supply resilience, and troop dispersion in exposed terrain. Commanders began to build redundancy into supply lines, avoiding single camps and preferring distributed bivouacs. Weather was no longer treated as background, it became a factor in planning. In this quiet way, Black Monday professionalized aspects of campaign planning. much like earlier battles had changed tactics in the field. It was not heroism, but it was historical evolution. The treaty's unraveling, peace on paper. Despite the initial jubilation in England over the Treaty of Breda, it was always a fragile peace. The territory Edward gained primarily in southwestern France was large but fragmented, full of hostile French-speaking populations and resentful nobles. Administering it proved difficult. Local lords resisted English laws. Tax collection was inconsistent. Trade routes were constantly harassed by rowdier disbanded mercenaries turned brigands. In France, the regency of Charles V, after his father John II's death in captivity, made no secret of his intent to restore France's territorial integrity. Though he had nominally accepted the terms of Breda, he delayed fulfilling certain clauses, including the full payment of John's ransom. Over the next 2 decades, France would slowly reclaim lost lands not by battle, but through siege, diplomacy, and attrition. Thus, the peace forged in the aftermath of Black Monday unraveled in slow motion, eroded not by catastrophe, but by the steady drip of time and resentment. A glimpse of what might have been. And yet, for all its fragility, the peace of 1360 represented a moment of possibility. Had it held, England might have retained control over 1/3 of France. The claim to the French crown might have been quietly retired, and Edward's reign remembered not only for war, but for statesmanship. More than that, the French people exhausted by warfare, taxation, and plague might have been spared the next 90 years of intermittent conflict that followed. But history is rarely so simple. Men with power rarely let it rest. Edward's descendants would reignite the war, reclaim the claim, and renew the cycle of death and diplomacy. By then, Edward himself would be a fading figure, old, weary, and largely removed from governance. The storm had ended one chapter, but it had not ended the war. Echoes in later wars. The tale of Black Monday, though rarely told in textbooks, lived on in the minds of military leaders across Europe. Future English campaigns, including those of Henry V, were shaped in part by the logistical lessons of Edward's 1360 march. The weather, once treated as a passive element, began to be recorded, tracked, and feared. Commanders studied the seasons with greater attention. Campaigns were launched with calendar precision to avoid late spring rains or early autumn fogs. And perhaps most tellingly, the idea of divine intervention in war so central to medieval thinking was never again ignored in campaign rhetoric. Kings carried chaplains, sought omens, and delayed movement for reasons as much religious as tactical. It was a lesson born of thunder. Nature's role in human history. Looking back, it is tempting to dismiss events like Black Monday as weather anomalies, historical footnotes. But in truth, they reveal something fundamental about human conflict, that no matter how carefully wars are planned, no matter how confident kings become or remain subject to forces beyond our control. The 100 Years' War was driven by inheritance law, national ambition, dynastic pride, and human stubbornness. But it was shaped, again and again, by chance and climate plagues, famines, storms. These are the boring realities of history, the unseen hands that shift the fate of empires not with battles, but with mud and mist, hailstones and hunger. A final reflection. Black Monday is not remembered like Agincourt or Poitiers. It has no heroes, no charges, no gallant speeches, but perhaps that's why it matters. It reminds us that history isn't only made in moments of triumph. Sometimes, it is shaped by a sudden wind, a falling sky, and the decision to turn back instead of forward. And so we are left with a question. If Edward had reached Paris that Easter, and if no storm had intervened, would he have worn the crown of France? Or would he have lost everything in a final, fatal gamble? We'll never know. Because on that day, the sky had other plans. Story 5, Joan of Arc, A Peasant's Prophecy. A kingdom divided. By the early 15th century, France was a kingdom in crisis. The 100 Years' War had already raged for generations. Much of the northern French countryside was held by the English, while the once unified French nobility had split into bitter factions. Chief among these were the Armagnacs, loyal to the crown princes Dauphin Charles and the Burgundians, who had allied themselves with the English, seeking their own claim to influence and power. The French monarchy itself was deeply weakened. King Charles VI, plagued by recurring bouts of mental illness, had become a symbolic monarch. Real governance had fractured. In his stead, political intrigue, regional warlords, and foreign occupation dictated daily life. And into this divided, weary land plagued by war, betrayal, and famine came a girl from nowhere, with a voice in her head and a mission from God. The child from Domremy. The story begins in the village of Domremy, nestled on the border of the Duchy of Bar, not far from Lorraine. It was an isolated rural community, poor, Catholic, and deeply aware of the war that surrounded them. There, in 1412, Jeanne d'Arc was born to Jacques d'Arc, a tenant farmer, and his wife Isabelle Remay. Her family lived modestly, owning a few animals and tilling the land. There was no noble blood, no military pedigree, no suggestion that their daughter would one day become a symbol of divine intervention. By all accounts, Joan was deeply pious from an early age. She attended Mass frequently, confessed often, and showed a precocious seriousness that set her apart from other children. She did not learn to read or write, but she memorized prayers and absorbed scripture through sermons. And then, when she was around 13 years old, the visions began. Voices from heaven. Joan would later describe her experiences as auditory and visual. She claimed to have been visited by Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret, figures revered in the Christian canon for courage, purity, and sacrifice. These visions instructed her that she had been chosen by God to help save France. More specifically, her mission was to drive out the English, restore Charles VII to his rightful throne, and assist in his sacred coronation at Reims. It is difficult to grasp today how radical such claims were. Joan was not a noblewoman, not a nun, not a scholar. She was a peasant girl, illiterate and unknown, claiming not only divine purpose but military direction. But in an age of widespread suffering, where death came as often by plague as by sword, many believed that only divine intervention could alter France's fortunes. Orléans, the crucible of France. By 1428, the situation had grown desperate. The English, under the leadership of Thomas Montagu and later John Talbot, had laid siege to the city of Orléans. This was no ordinary siege, it was a gateway to the heart of France. If Orléans fell, the English would have a straight path to the Loire Valley and beyond. The crown prince, Charles VII, still uncrowned and weak in authority, would likely never claim his throne. To many, this was the moment where France's very survival was at stake. And this is where Joan of Arc enters history not as a mystic, but as a military figure. The road to Chinon. Joan had by this time convinced a local garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, to allow her to travel to Chinon, where Charles VII held court in exile. Initially skeptical, Baudricourt allegedly changed his mind after hearing of Joan's prophecy that a French defeat had just occurred near Orléans. News later confirmed the event, and Joan's reputation began to grow. She traveled to Chinon in early 1429, escorted by a small group of loyal soldiers. It was a dangerous journey through hostile territory. She dressed in men's clothing, a decision that would later bring scrutiny, but which afforded her some protection. Upon arrival, she demanded an audience with Charles VII. And remarkably, she got it. The Dauphin's test. Charles VII, cautious and politically astute, did not greet Joan with immediate enthusiasm. To his court, she was either a madwoman or a tool of propaganda, perhaps both. But Charles also understood symbolism. If Joan could inspire hope among his subjects, she could serve a purpose. He decided to test her. According to legend, Charles disguised himself among his courtiers during their first meeting. Joan, undeterred, identified him immediately. When pressed, she claimed that God had revealed his face to her. Whether or not this event occurred as described, it impressed the court. The Dauphin authorized a theological examination at Poitiers to determine whether Joan's visions were heresy or truth. After weeks of inquiry, the clerics declared they had found no evidence of deception. Joan, they concluded, was a good Christian, and if her mission was of God, it would become clear in time. She was given a sword, a banner, and command of a small army. A banner in the wind. Joan's banner was white, embroidered with lilies, and bore the names Jesus and Mary. She carried no weapon in battle, only the banner, which she said was her true calling. Before she departed for Orleans, she had her hair cut short, adopted full male armor, and declared herself a maiden warrior in service of heaven. Many were skeptical, some were outraged, but others, worn down by years of defeat and humiliation, began to believe. For the first time in decades, the French army was being led not by a grizzled knight or ambitious duke, but by a teenager from the fields of Domremy, claiming to hear the voices of saints. The siege of Orleans begins to shift. Joan arrived at Orleans in April 1429. The city had been under siege for over 6 months, and its morale was crumbling. English forces had built a ring of fortifications around it, known as Les Bastilles, cutting off supplies and communication. Joan's presence revived French morale. Her mere arrival became a rallying cry. Her banner was seen as a divine sign, and though she did not command strategy directly, she became a focal point of resistance. The French forces, bolstered by this renewed spirit, launched a series of assaults on the English bastilles. Joan was frequently at the front, urging soldiers forward, refusing to retreat, and reportedly surviving multiple arrow wounds. The turning point came on May 7, when the French attacked the Bastille of Les Tourelles, the key southern stronghold. Joan was wounded by an arrow to the shoulder but returned to the field later that day to lead the final charge. On May 8, the English abandoned the siege. Orleans had been saved. A nation watches in wonder. The victory at Orleans was not just military, it was spiritual. Joan's presence, and her insistence that her mission came from God, turned the tide of public sentiment. Cities that had once teetered on rebellion now rallied to the Dauphin's cause. Nobles who had held back their loyalty began to reconsider. For the first time in years, France had a story not of defeat, but of divine favor. And Joan's next objective, and perhaps the most improbable, was to escort Charles VII to Reims, the traditional site of royal coronation. It was deep in enemy territory, far from secure lines. But Joan insisted Charles must be crowned or France would remain adrift. An unfinished journey. And so, the girl from Domremy prepared to lead her king not into battle this time, but toward legitimacy. It was a mission of symbol over strategy, of faith over feasibility. And yet, within months, Joan would succeed. But her rise would not be without consequences. In lifting a king, she was inviting resentment. In claiming visions, she was courting heresy. And in defying English power, she was painting a target on her back. The world was watching. A quiet question in a thunderous time. How did a teenage peasant, with no military training or noble background, come to lead armies, lift sieges, and alter the course of one of history's longest wars? Was she truly guided by divine voice or by a force more earthly, a desperate nation's yearning for hope? And more importantly, what would happen when that hope no longer served the power she had helped restore? A coronation in enemy territory. It was an ambition that bordered on the impossible. Following her miraculous arrival at Orleans and the lifting of the siege, Joan of Arc had turned her gaze to Reims, the traditional coronation site of French kings. This was no random destination. To her, and to many others steeped in the beliefs of divine monarchy, a true king could only be crowned in Reims, anointed by sacred oil and legitimized in the eyes of God. But Reims lay deep in enemy territory, surrounded by towns and provinces that had either aligned with the English or the Burgundians, or were too uncertain to commit. The idea of pushing northward against superior fortifications, with limited supplies, and a politically hesitant court seemed, at best, quixotic. And yet Joan would not be dissuaded. Charles VII hesitates. Following Orleans, the Dauphin Charles had gained both popularity and breathing room, but he remained a passive, uncertain figure, more comfortable in his indecision than in asserting authority. Joan urged him. He must go to Reims and claim his crown. France needed not just victories but legitimacy. The voices that guided her, she insisted, had made it clear was God's chosen king, and it was time he stepped into that divine role. But Charles, ever cautious, dithered. He feared an ambush, feared diplomatic fallout, and most of all, feared failure. He lacked the conviction that Joan seemed to possess in limitless supply. At court, many of his advisors dismissed her. They whispered of heresy, of manipulation, and of the danger of trusting a peasant with a cause so critical. But Joan had supporters too. The victory at Orleans had transformed her image. Soldiers saw her as blessed, common folk saw her as a savior, and some nobles, eager for renewed prestige, rallied to her side. Eventually, Charles relented. In June 1429, the army began its march toward Reims, toward the crown, and toward a moment that would cement Joan's place in the annals of European history. The march north, a new kind of warfare. This campaign was not marked by pitched battles or grand sieges. Rather, it was a symbolic procession, a strategic and psychological march intended to sway public opinion. As Joan's army approached various towns, Auxerre, Troyes, Chalonsthe were welcomed, not resisted. Even cities that had shown loyalty to the Burgundian cause opened their gates, some out of faith, others out of fear or exhaustion. This was warfare by presence. Joan's army didn't have to fight their way through the countryside, they convinced it to come along with them. Tales of her miracles, her prophecies, and her steadfast bravery spread like fire. Villages sent supplies. Citizens waved flags. Priests gave sermons. By the time they neared Reims in mid-July, the city's leader, cynically reluctant, capitulated without resistance. Joan had done the impossible. The way to the coronation was open. The coronation of Charles VII. On 17 July 1429, in the Grand Cathedral of Notre Dame de Reims, Charles VII was crowned King of France, anointed with holy oil that had, by legend, been delivered to Clovis I by a dove from heaven. It was a moment of intense symbolism and relief. For the first time in years, France had a crowned and consecrated king, and standing nearby, clad in armor but holding her white banner, was Joan of Arc, the peasant who had brought him there. Chroniclers say that after the coronation, Joan knelt before Charles and wept, calling him noble king, and thanking God for allowing her to fulfill her purpose. But her mission, she insisted, was not yet over. The crown without a capital. Coronation did not mean peace. Though Charles now had the anointed title of king, his control over Paris, the historic capital, remained elusive. The English still held the city, and the Burgundians, under Duke Philip the Good, remained in firm alliance with them. Joan turned her attention to Paris, urging an assault before the enemy could regroup. She argued that now was the time to strike, to solidify the coronation with decisive military pressure. Charles again hesitated. His nature, read amid, legalistic, and steeped in diplomatic caution, clashed with Joan's fervor. Still, pressure from her allies pushed him forward, and in August 1429, the French army began preparing for an assault on the capital. It would be Joan's first major setback. The assault on Paris. On 8 September 1429, Joan led a frontal attack on the northern gate of Paris, known as the Porte Saint-Honoré. The assault was ambitious, even reckless. The English and Burgundian defenders were well prepared, heavily armed, and expecting an attack. Joan took to the front lines, as she always did. Her banner flew above the noise, and she urged her men forward again and again. But the city held. Joan was struck in the thigh by a crossbow bolt, and though she refused to retreat, the assault eventually faltered. Charles, cautious and unnerved by the resistance, called off the attack and ordered a withdrawal. It was the first major failure of Joan's campaign and one that changed everything. A waning influence. The failed attack on Paris marked the beginning of a political shift. At court, Joan's critics regained influence. They pointed to the rashness of the Paris assault as proof that she was no longer acting in France's best interest. Charles, now officially king, began to distance himself from the woman who had brought him to power. Though she continued to lead small campaigns liberating towns along the Loire and pushing back English forces, was no longer central to royal planning. Joan herself felt it. In letters and testimonies, she expressed frustration at the court's indecision and anguish over the suffering still plaguing France. She believed her voices were still guiding her, but her political authority was slipping. And she sensed, perhaps dimly, that her time was running out. The Burgundian betrayal. In the spring of 1430, Joan rode north again, this time to Compiègne, a city under siege by Burgundian forces. Determined to defend the town, she led a sortie on 23 May, but it was a trap. As her forces attempted to retreat into the safety of the city, the gates were closed too soon. Whether by accident or betrayal is unknown, and Joan was captured by the Burgundians. She was handed over to the English, who had long considered her a criminal, a heretic, and a symbol of French rebellion. For them, this was more than a prisoner of war. It was a chance to destroy a myth. The turning of the tide. As Joan sat in a cell, the war continued without her, but something had changed. Even in captivity, her legend grew. Soldiers still spoke of her bravery, clerics still debated her visions, and the people, especially in the countryside, saw her as God's abandoned champion. The English prepared for a trial, but it would be more than a court proceeding. It would be a battle for Joan's legacy, for the truth behind her visions, and for the soul of France. Joan's captors believed they could discredit her through theology and fear. But Joanna, 19 years old, was not done fighting. An open question. Why did Charles VII, once lifted to his throne by Joan's conviction, allow her to fall? Why did he not ransom her or even raise a protest? Was it political caution, a desire to move beyond her shadow, or had he come to fear what she represented, a power beyond kings, beyond court, beyond control? In the end, was Joan ever more than a means to an end? These questions linger, as does her story. Captive of the enemy. Joan of Arc's capture at Compiègne in May 1430 ended her military career. It marked the moment her legend began to ossify, not through acts of war, but through her trial and martyrdom. Handed over to the English by the Burgundians for a substantial ransom, about 10,000 livres tournois, Joan was transferred to Rouen, the English administrative center in northern France. Here, she would face not a conventional trial of war, but a religious inquisition. Her accusers, backed by English authorities, intended to destroy her public image. They needed to prove that she had been no messenger of God, but a heretic, a fraud, or worse, a possessed. What followed was a trial meticulously recorded, yet heavily politicized. It would not only test Joan's faith and intellect, but would lay bare the dynamics of power, fear, and belief in the waning days of medieval France. A trial in shadows. The trial formally began in January 1431. Presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, an ambitious clergyman aligned with the English. The court was stacked with ecclesiastical judges who were selected not for impartiality, but for their willingness to reach a foregone conclusion. Cauchon had long supported the English claim to the French throne. To him, Joan represented a dangerous symbol of resistance. If she had indeed been guided by divine visions, it would suggest that God favored Charles VII, undermining the entire English effort. To justify Joan's execution, they needed more than political condemnation, they needed theological evidence. The charges against her were extensive. Wearing men's clothing, claiming divine visions, defying church authority, engaging in sorcery and witchcraft. In short, they aimed to paint her not as a pious girl from Domremy, but as an instrument of the devil. Joan the Defender. But Joan proved a formidable opponent. Despite her lack of formal education and the pressure of incarceration, she answered the charges with remarkable clarity and resilience. Her interrogators tried to trap her in inconsistencies, to elicit damning confessions, or to provoke blasphemy. But Joan remained calm, often outwitting her accusers. When asked whether she was in a state of grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was a brilliant answer. The Church taught that only God could know the state of a soul, and so, in a single sentence, Joan deflected a theological trap and reaffirmed her devotion. She refused to deny her visions, naming Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret repeatedly. She insisted that God had spoken to her. She never claimed prophecy for its own sake, only as a divine mission to save France. Her faith, under immense pressure, did not falter. The clothes on her back. The charge that would ultimately seal Joan's fate, and appear most absurd to modern eyes, was her habit of wearing men's clothing armor during battle, and later, tunics and hose during her imprisonment. To the court, this was not a trivial detail. Canon law forbade women from dressing as men, unless under extreme necessity. To Joan, however, the clothing was protection against both assault and symbolic vulnerability. She was often kept in a military prison, guarded by male soldiers, and had no female attendants. She testified that wearing male clothes protected her modesty. At one point during the trial, under duress and likely threat of execution, Joan signed an abjuration document stating she would renounce her visions and adopt female dress. It may have been signed without full understanding, or perhaps out of desperation. But days later, she was found wearing men's clothing again. When asked why, she said simply, "It was more fitting. I did it by the counsel of God." The judges saw their opportunity. She had relapsed. Her heresy was now declared persistent. The execution. On 30 May 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. She was 19 years old. Chained to a wooden post, dressed once again in male clothing, she reportedly asked for a cross, which a sympathetic English soldier fashioned from sticks and handed to her. A priest held a crucifix before her eyes as she burned. Her final word, repeated over and over, was Jesus. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine Riverdo, prevent her followers from collecting relics. Those who witnessed the execution were deeply affected. Some English soldiers wept. Even her enemies, it seemed, felt uneasy. A century of war had taken many lives, but in burning Joan, the English had perhaps created a martyr, not extinguished a flame. Aftermath: the war continues. In the years following Joan's death, the tide of the 100 Years' War began to turn permanently in favor of the French. Charles VII, now solidly in power, gradually reconquered French territories. The Treaty of Arras, 1435, ended the alliance between the English and the Burgundians, an alliance whose rupture had once been Joan's personal mission. By 1453, the English had lost almost all their French holdings, save for Calais. The war was, for all practical purposes, over. Joan did not live to see the final victory, but her symbolic role was immense. She had rekindled national pride, bolstered a faltering monarchy, and transformed what had been a dynastic feud into a crusade for legitimacy. The retrial clearing her name. In 1456, 25 years after her execution, Charles VII ordered a posthumous retrial of Joan's case. The purpose was clear: to clear the name of the woman who had made his crown possible. Over 100 witnesses were called: clergy, soldiers, townspeople who had known Joan personally testified to her piety, virtue, and sincerity. The transcripts of the original trial were reviewed, and their political motivations laid bare. The verdict was reversed. Joan of Arc was declared innocent. Her original trial was deemed corrupt and unjust. She was proclaimed a martyr. It was, perhaps, too little and too late, but it signaled her transformation from folk heroine to national icon. Canonization and immortality. Joan's story did not end in Rouen, or even in the dusty volumes of 15th-century chronicles. Over the centuries, her legend grew. In 1909, she was beatified by the Catholic Church. In 1920, she was declared a saint. Today, Saint Joan of Arc is one of the most revered figures in French history. She is the patron saint of France, a symbol of resistance, courage, and the strange intersections between faith and power. Her image appears in cathedrals, paintings, literature, and political rhetoric. Both conservatives and radicals have claimed her legacy. She is invoked by soldiers, feminists, mystics, and monarchists alike. For a peasant girl who once heard voices in a meadow, it is a legacy beyond comprehension. A final reflection. What does Joan of Arc's story teach us? That history is often shaped not by kings and generals alone, but by those outside the margins of power. That faith, regardless of its source, can stir a nation. That conviction, when placed in the hands of the marginalized, is often viewed as dangerous. Joan was used by the French crown, destroyed by the English church, and later redeemed by history. She fought not just for a king, but for a vision of justice she believed came from heaven. And though burned in body, her story remains an ember of the past, still glowing. Story 6: The Black Prince, Glory and Exhaustion. The boy born for battle. Edward of Woodstock, known to history as the Black Prince, was born on 15 June 1330, the eldest son of King Edward III of England and Philippa of Hainault. From the moment of his birth, his destiny was closely tied to war. He was, quite literally, born into the 100 Years' War, a conflict his father would formalize just 8 years later with a bold claim to the French throne. As heir apparent, young Edward was raised in a culture that idolized chivalry, conquest, and the ideals of knighthood. The English nobility of the 14th century romanticized war as a noble endeavor, and for Edward, martial prowess would define his entire life. He was trained in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and military strategy from childhood. But unlike many princes, Edward would test these skills on real battlefields before the age of 20. In time, he would become both a hero and a symbol admired for his courage, feared for his ruthlessness, and remembered long after his early death. The origins of the Black Prince's name. Curiously, Edward was never called the Black Prince in his lifetime. The name appears to have emerged decades later, possibly due to the color of his armor, or more likely, his dark reputation among the French, who suffered greatly under his campaigns. This sobriquet, though retrospective, would come to define him in modern memory, marking a shift from idealized chivalry to a more realistic and somber view of war. But before that legacy hardened, Edward was simply a young prince, eager to prove himself in service to his father's ambition. The Creasy Campaign, baptism by fire. Edward's first true campaign came in 1346, when he was just 16 years old. His father, Edward III, launched a major invasion of France, aiming to assert his claim to the crown and disrupt the French monarchy. The army landed in Normandy and began a brutal march through northern France, pillaging towns and terrorizing the countryside, a common and accepted military strategy of the time. Young Edward was placed in command of a division of the army. This was not merely ceremonial. He was expected to lead in battle, to rally troops, and to carry the weight of royal authority into combat. On 26 August 1346, the English army faced a much larger French force at Crécy-en-Ponthieu. The odds were against the English, but they held a strong defensive position, armed with longbows and prepared for a fight. The battle became one of the most decisive in medieval history. The English longbow and the fall of French chivalry. Creasy was a showcase of technological and tactical innovation. The English longbowmen, arrayed in staggered lines, unleashed a rain of arrows that decimated the French cavalry before it could even reach English lines. The French, heavily armored and following the traditional chivalric doctrine of headlong charge, failed to adapt. Confusion reigned among their ranks, especially as the blind King John of Bohemia charged into battle, guided by his knights, and was slaughtered. In the thick of it all stood Prince Edward. At one point the French broke through and reached his position. The young prince was unseated and the fighting grew desperate. A messenger was sent to Edward III asking for reinforcements. The king, observing from a nearby hill, allegedly replied, "Let the boy win his spurs." Edward rallied, his knights counterattacked, the French were thrown back. By nightfall, thousands of French nobles lay dead. The English had lost fewer than 300 men. Edward had not only proven himself, had forged a legend. The Siege of Calais and the ruthlessness of war. After Creasy, the English army laid siege to Calais, a vital port city on the English Channel. The siege lasted for almost a year, from September 1346 to August 1347. It became a test not only of military endurance but of psychological warfare. The citizens of Calais endured starvation and disease. When the city finally surrendered, Edward III demanded 6 of the city's leading citizens be brought to him barefoot, with nooses around their necks, ready for execution punishment for their resistance. Though Queen Philippa interceded and the burghers were spared, the moment revealed a darker side of English warfare. Edward of Woodstock watched and learned. Calais became a permanent English possession, held until 1558. For the young prince, it was another step into a life where honor and cruelty were never far apart. Return to England and the Garter Order. In 1348, the prince returned to England in triumph. He had gained renown as a warrior and nobleman, and his father rewarded him by making him one of the first knights of the Garter, a new order of chivalry meant to rival the greatest in Europe. The Order of the Garter, founded by Edward III, was more than ceremonial. It was a way to bind powerful nobles to the crown, to reinforce loyalty through shared prestige. For Edward, this was a moment of ritual ascension. He was no longer a boy warrior. He was now a pillar of the kingdom, expected to uphold the ideals of English monarchy and lead future campaigns. But the 100 Years' War was far from over. And Edward's most famous and infamous chapter was still to come. The road to Poitiers. By the 1350s, the French had begun to recover from the disasters of Crecy and Calais. King John II of France had come to power and attempted to reform the French military. At the same time, Edward III began focusing more on domestic matters, entrusting military leadership increasingly to his son. In 1355, Edward of Woodstock led a massive chevauchée, a mounted raid across southern France. This was not traditional warfare, it was scorched earth. His army pillaged towns, burned fields, and captured villages, avoiding major engagements but inflicting terror on the population. The strategy aimed to provoke the French king into battle, weaken local economies, and demonstrate English dominance. The campaign devastated the Languedoc region. Thousands were displaced. Prosperous towns like Carcassonne were emptied. It was effective but brutal. And in 1356, the French king would finally rise to meet him. An unfinished duel. As Prince Edward moved north through Aquitaine, King John II raised an army to intercept him. The two forces clashed near Poitiers in September 1356. Though Edward's force was outnumbered, he employed terrain to his advantage, positioning his men behind hedgerows and using his longbowmen to funnel French forces into kill zones. The result was catastrophic for France. The French army was shattered. Thousands were killed or captured. Most shockingly, King John II himself was taken prisoner, along with many nobles. He would be held in England for years, used as a bargaining chip in negotiations, and eventually ransomed. It was the greatest English victory since Creased. Once again, Edward of Woodstock was at the center. But victory would bring no peace. A question of legacy. By 1356, Edward had become the most successful English general of the war. He had bested two French kings on the battlefield, carved out a reputation for brilliance, and established a foothold in southern France. But beneath the triumphs lay a deeper issue. Could conquest without stability ever last? Was Edward building an enduring legacy or simply exhausting his resources, his army, and eventually himself? As he prepared to rule over Aquitaine as its prince, Edward would find that administration demanded more than swords and spurs. His health would decline, his rule would sour, and his final campaigns would test his ideals like never before. From conqueror to administrator. Following his victories at Creasy and Poitiers, Edward of Woodstock was no longer merely the heir to the English throne, was now a living symbol of English power in France. In 1362, his father Edward III bestowed upon him a grand title, Prince of Aquitaine and Gascony. With this title came direct control over a vast swathe of southwestern France, stretching from the Pyrenees to the river Loire. Edward established his court in Bordeaux, transforming the city into the political center of English holdings in France. This court was grand and ceremonious, attracting knights, nobles, and foreign dignitaries. Here, the prince was no longer just a warrior, was a governor, judge, and lawgiver. But conquest and governance required two different skill sets, and as the 1360s progressed, the Black Prince would discover that his battlefield brilliance did not always translate into effective administration. The weight of war's aftermath. The war had devastated the region. Aquitaine, though fertile and prosperous in parts, had suffered years of scorched earth tactics, pillaging, and sieges. Many towns had been depopulated. Roads were unsafe. Trade had stalled. Edward's arrival brought initial hope. Locals believed the prince might restore order and prosperity. But instead of reconstruction, the English government focused on securing taxes, imposing English law, and rewarding loyalists. To maintain his court and army, Edward needed money, but his territories, already strained, could not provide it without burdening the population. Taxes were levied. Discontent grew. At the same time, Edward was still a military leader. He retained his elite retinue of knights and archers, ready to campaign again if called. Their maintenance required significant resources. Edward now faced the age-old problem of empire: how to finance occupation without alienating the occupied. The marriage to Joan of Kent. In 1361, Edward married Joan of Kent, a noblewoman with a controversial past. She had previously been married and bore children, of whom Thomas Holland would become a future earl. Joan was also Edward's cousin, and their union raised concern in courtly circles, though it was eventually sanctioned. Still, the marriage was deeply affectionate. Together they had 2 sons, Edward of Angoulême, who died young, and Richard of Bordeaux, later King Richard II. Joan became a powerful presence at the court in Bordeaux. Intelligent and politically savvy, she helped maintain stability in times of growing unrest. But their domestic peace could not withstand what was coming next, another military campaign, one that would drain Edward's strength-hand reputation. The Castilian Campaign, 1367. In 1366, the exiled King Pedro I of Castile, known as Pedro the Cruel, appealed to Edward for help. He had been deposed by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, with support from France. The conflict threatened to destabilize the Iberian Peninsula and draw France and England into another proxy war. Edward agreed to restore Pedro to his throne, both